The year was 1944. Winter had gripped Europe in its iron fist, and the wind whispered over frozen fields like a mournful ghost. In a remote Allied prisoner-of-war camp in France, a group of German female soldiers huddled together, their uniforms thin and tattered, their eyes hollow from weeks of hunger and fear. The world outside seemed impossibly distant. Smoke from bombed towns drifting like memories across the landscape, the distant rumble of artillery reminding them of the chaos they had once been part of. Yet inside the camp, a strange, almost surreal quiet settled, broken only by the shuffle of boots on the frost-hardened earth and the murmured conversations of women clinging to fragments of hope. For these women, the notion of mercy had long been an abstract concept, something they had read about or heard whispered in stories, but never truly experienced. They had fought, they had fled, they had surrendered, and now they waited, uncertain of what the next day might bring. Then as the dawn broke, a wooden cart creaked into the yard, laden with steaming bowls of food. The aroma was intoxicating, warm bread, rich soups, and thin slices of meat, all offered without suspicion or demand. It was an act of kindness that seemed impossible in a world defined by brutality. For a fleeting moment, hunger collided with gratitude, fear softened into awe, and these women realized that even in the midst of war, humanity could still shine. Their hands trembled as they reached for the food, unsure if this was a gift or a test. In that moment, they discovered a truth far more powerful than any weapon. Mercy, served simply on a plate, could pierce the hardest hearts and ignite a fragile flame of hope in even the darkest of times. The order echoed across the processing yard like a cold blade slicing through already frayed nerves, and for a moment it felt as though the entire camp stopped breathing. The women, thin, exhausted, half frozen from days of marching, stood motionless, their bodies instinctively tightening as if preparing for a blow. Some clutched their collars with trembling fingers, others folded their arms across their chests as though shielding themselves from a remembered horror rather than the morning wind. The command had been simple, spoken without malice, without humor, without the crude threat they had come to associate with such moments. Remove your outer garments for inspection. And yet, to women who had spent months hearing similar words used as a prelude to humiliation, the sentence struck like lightning. For a few seconds only the wind dared move. It hissed across the open dirt yard, lifting corners of tents, flicking dust into the air, and tugging at the women's coats as they held onto them like lifelines. The American guards stood several paces away, neither advancing nor repeating the order, simply watching the line of prisoners with unreadable expressions. Their faces looked hard, weathered by long months of war, but not cruel, just disciplined, focused, almost detached. That detachment puzzled the prisoners. They had expected staring. They had expected grins. They had expected the smugness of victors now in possession of defeated women. But they saw none of that. Instead, the guards looked busy. One scribbled something on a clipboard. Another checked the straps of a crate stacked with folded forms. A medic stood near a wooden table laid with brushes, gloves, and disinfectant, tapping his pen absently against his palm. They behaved like men at work, not men hunting for entertainment. But fear has its own logic, one that refuses evidence and clings to memory. And the women had memories enough to fill 10 lifetimes. A younger prisoner, no older than 19, moved first. Her breath came out in a hard, shaky cloud, and with a small, instinctive whimper, she loosened her coat. The coat was too big for her. It had belonged to someone else once, and the sleeves hung past her wrists. As she slid it off her shoulders, she shut her eyes tightly, as if bracing herself for the moment something awful would happen. Nothing did. The guard in front of her did not even look up from his clipboard. An older woman, her hair streaked with dirt and silver, her cheeks carved by exhaustion, placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. "Just the coat?" she whispered, more to comfort herself than the trembling prisoner beside her. "Only the coat." But even as she said it, her voice cracked, because she had learned long ago that in war, simple orders often led to moments that ended differently than promised. Yet something in the Americans' stillness kept the line frozen in uncertainty. If they meant harm, why weren't they closing in? Why weren't they leering, shouting, rushing the process? The seconds stretched, a crow cawed from the top of a distant pine tree. The wind shifted again, and then one of the guards finally looked up. Not at the women, not at their bodies, but at the coats gathering in the young prisoner's hands. "Outer garments only," he repeated calmly, speaking slowly, as if aware that language itself was a barrier as thick as the fence around the camp. He pointed to the coats, then to the inspection table, then stepped back again, deliberately widening the space between them. The gesture was small, but powerful. A signal, a boundary, a line in the dirt that said, "We will not cross this." The realization did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like dawn light sliding across a room where people have spent the night in fear. One by one, the women began to understand. The Americans weren't treating them as women first. They were treating them as prisoners. Captured soldiers. People undergoing procedure, not prey awaited for exploitation. It felt both relieving and surreal. After months in a war where surrendering often meant stripping away one's dignity along with one's uniform, this simple distance, this basic respect, felt almost unreal. Still, old instincts die hard. A tall woman with sharp cheekbones and haunted eyes hesitated longer than the rest. She gripped her coat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind replayed every story she had heard on the front, stories whispered between women who had survived encounters they refused to describe out loud. Stories passed like warnings: do not be alone, do not fall behind, do not trust the men who capture you. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, her breath shaky, but finally, when she saw the medic remain completely absorbed in preparing a brush and the nearest guard turn away to speak quietly to an officer, she slowly loosened her fingers. As coats began to pile on the inspection tables, a new emotion replaced the raw panic confusion. Sharp, disorienting confusion. It felt strange to be ignored after expecting the worst. The guards directed their focus not on the women but on the process, carefully checking pockets, feeling seams for hidden weapons, unfolding sleeves to ensure no documents or blades were tucked inside. Every movement they made was methodical, efficient, practiced. The women watched in stunned silence. A few exchanged glances, silently asking each other if they were truly seeing what they thought they were seeing. One of them muttered, barely audible, "They're not even looking at us!" Another responded, almost in disbelief, "They're just doing their work." For the first time since entering the camp, a ripple of fragile calm passed through the line. It loosened shoulders, softened jaws, and allowed breath to come a little easier. But relief came mingled with disbelief and suspicion. Could this be a trick? A setup? A false moment of calm before something darker? War had conditioned them to doubt every kindness. And yet, the Americans continued on, indifferent to the fears stirring inside their prisoners. One guard, noticing the tension still etched on their faces, stepped several more paces back. He kept his hands visible at all times, palms open, his stance none threatening. His eyes scanned the ground rather than the women. It was another small gesture, barely noticeable to someone who had never known fear. But to the prisoners, it felt like an act of compassion disguised as routine professionalism. Gradually, as more outer garments were surrendered and the Americans continued their quiet, impersonal inspection, the women's terror began to dissolve into a heavy, tentative understanding. This was not humiliation. This was not the stripping of dignity they had feared. This was protocol. Cold, impersonal, bureaucratic, but fair. One of the medics called out instructions to a younger soldier in English too quick for the prisoners to understand, but his tone carried no threat. He pointed at the coats, at the brushes, at the disinfectant. He gestured to the women only to direct them to stand in line so that each piece of clothing could be processed, checked for lice, and dusted. His eyes remained downward, focused solely on his task. To the women, this focus was startling. It showed discipline. It showed boundaries they were not accustomed to from enemy soldiers. In the quiet spaces between commands and shuffling feet, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Americans were not here to strip their dignity. They were here to enforce regulations. The war might have taught the women to brace for the cruelty of men, but here, at least in this moment, they were encountering something profoundly different, something that felt almost radical in the chaos of 1945. They were encountering respect. Not kindness, not warmth, not friendship. Those were luxuries neither side could afford. But respect. A recognition that even prisoners deserved a certain distance, a certain privacy, a certain boundary. It was an unfamiliar kind of mercy, one born from discipline rather than compassion, but it was mercy all the same. As more coats were folded and checked, the atmosphere shifted further. The line no longer looked like a line of trembling captives awaiting violation. It looked like a line of soldiers, tired, defeated, wary, being processed by an army that saw them as part of a system rather than as objects of conquest. And in that transformation, something inside the women quietly broke open. Whether from relief or exhaustion, no one could tell. But it felt like a door they had kept locked for months had finally budged. Their hearts did not exactly lighten. War had taken too much from them for lightness. But their fear softened, thinning like fog that the sun was beginning to burn away. One prisoner, who had barely spoken since arrival, finally whispered to the woman beside her, "They're not going to hurt us." The words were fragile, trembling, almost unbelieving, but saying them out loud felt like releasing a breath she had been holding since the moment she entered the truck days earlier. No one responded, but several eyes glistened. The line shifted forward a few steps as a guard motioned for the next group to place their coats on the inspection table. And as they moved, the women realized that the worst they had feared had existed only in memory. Terrible, oppressive memories that the Americans, unintentionally, were helping to unravel. The inspection continued in near silence, interrupted only by the occasional scrape of boots on dirt or the rustle of fabric being unfolded. To an outsider, the scene might have looked mundane, methodical routine. But to the German POW women living through it, this moment was monumental. This was the moment they realized something they had never dared hope for. Their captors did not intend to degrade them. Their captors intended to process them, house them, and keep them alive. The smallest flicker of dignity, something they believed long lost, returned to their eyes. And though the wind remained cold and the camp remained a prison, the fear that had wrapped itself around their hearts began, at last, to loosen. When the coats had finally been taken and the inspection continued without incident, the women were guided toward another section of the camp, an area marked by neat rows of wooden benches and a series of canvas tents arranged with surprising order. The path leading there was quiet, lined with small gravel stones that crunched under their boots. The women walked slowly, cautiously, still unsure what awaited them. Though their fear had softened, it had not faded completely. Fear built over months of brutality did not vanish in minutes. Yet as they looked around, something felt different. It was not the environment of a camp preparing to punish its prisoners. It felt more like a place preparing to process them, care for them, and make sense of the suffering they carried with them. A medic stood ahead, waiting, not looming, not barking orders, simply waiting with a clipboard in hand. He looked younger than the guards, his face gentle, though marked by long nights and longer marches. When the first group of women reached him, he did not raise his voice, did not gesture sharply, did not force them into position. He simply motioned toward the benches and spoke slowly, clearly, using simple English words they might understand. Set, rest, medical check. He pointed to the benches, then to his stethoscope, then to the table where canteens of water waited. His gestures were not commands, they were explanations. The women hesitated. It had been a long time since any soldier gave them an order that included rest. A long time since water had been left in plain view without someone shouting at them to drink quickly and move on. A long time since the word medical meant anything other than interrogation or forced inspection. Yet here they were being told to sit down, just sit and rest. One of them, the same older woman who had comforted the frightened girl during the coat inspection, moved hesitantly toward the bench. She tested the wood with her hand first, as though expecting it to collapse or be uncomfortably rough. But it was smooth, clean, and sturdy. When she finally sat, her legs trembled with relief. Not emotional relief, physical relief. For days she had been walking on blistered feet, swollen inside boots that no longer fit properly. She had forced herself to remain upright because falling behind meant disappearing. But here, the bench did not symbolize punishment. It symbolized survival. As the other women joined her, the medics approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance until each woman nodded. A gesture that signaled, however hesitantly, permission to come closer. The Americans seemed to understand that these prisoners were not merely tired. They were traumatized, and any sudden movement could reignite their panic. So the medics moved with deliberate gentleness, speaking quietly to one another as they worked. The first prisoner to be checked was the youngest. She looked like she might faint, her face pale with exhaustion and nerves. A medic knelt beside her, not towering over her, not grabbing her chin to force eye contact, not yanking her arms into position. He knelt. The gesture shocked the girl so deeply that she tightened her hands into fists, unsure how to respond. But the medic simply held out a canteen, offering it toward her like a peace token. "Drink," he said softly. For a moment, the girl did not move. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached for the canteen. She took a cautious sip, expecting bitterness. Instead, the water was clean and cold, flowing down her dry throat like something precious. She closed her eyes as she drank again, savoring the taste as if she had forgotten what real water felt like. Nearby, another medic unfolded a small cloth and began cleaning one of the women's scraped knuckles. When she flinched at the touch, he paused immediately, pulling his hand back. "Okay," he murmured, waiting until she nodded before continuing. No one had ever paused for her consent during the war. No one had ever waited for her to approve the next step. She stared at him, stunned by a kind of courtesy she had not known soldiers were capable of. The benches filled with quiet murmurs, soft breaths shifting boots, the occasional gasp of surprise when a medic treated a wound more gently than expected. The women watched each other, each searching for signs that this was not a trick. But the Americans' behavior remained consistent. Calm, professional, almost strangely routine. One prisoner, who had been silent since the moment she was captured, finally broke her silence. "Why are they like this?" she whispered to the woman beside her. The answer did not come from another prisoner. It came from the medic who had overheard her. In slow, thickly accented German, clearly learned quickly, imperfectly, he replied, "Because war is finished. You are safe here. The word struck the women harder than he realized. Safe. A word that had vanished from their vocabulary. A word that had seemed impossible, unimaginable, a fantasy belonging to a world that no longer existed. Yet here it was, spoken in broken German by a man who, by every rule of war, should have hated them. For the first time that day, some of the women began to cry. Not loud, hiving sobs. Those would come later, when their bodies finally allowed themselves to break. These were quiet tears, slipping down hollow cheeks with the gentleness of rain. Tears made not from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of not being mistreated. A guard approached one of the crying women, and she stiffened immediately, expecting reprimand. But instead of shouting at her to stop or demanding she stand, he simply placed a hand on his chest and nodded to her. A gesture that meant he understood her emotion, even if he didn't understand her words. Then he turned and walked away, giving her the space to cry in peace. As the medical checks continued, the women noticed something else. The Americans were careful never to touch them unnecessarily. Every gesture was preceded by a word, a question, a look that asked permission without saying it aloud. They checked ankles, wrists, throats, and breathing. But always with professionalism, always with distance, always with respect. One prisoner still held on to her suspicion. She watched every movement closely, her eyes narrowed with guarded defiance. When a medic reached for her wrist to take her pulse, she jerked away sharply. The medic froze, his hands snapping back like he had touched a flame. She expected anger, maybe an order shouted in frustration, maybe an accusation. But the medic simply nodded, placing his stethoscope back around his neck. Later, he said kindly, stepping back to allow her space. She stared at him, bewildered. In a different camp, in a different time, such defiance would have earned a blow. Here, it earned only patience. The surprise of it all was too much for some. One woman whispered, "Why aren't they punishing us?" Another added, "Do they not know what we did? Do they not know what we were part of?" They spoke softly, barely audible, but the questions lingered in the air like smoke. But perhaps the truth was simpler. The Americans did know. They knew the war's horrors. They knew the sides were stained with more than dirt and gunpowder. But they also knew that these women were prisoners now, not soldiers, not enemies, not targets. Their task was to care for them, record them, keep them alive until the war's administrative machinery decided their fate. And so they did exactly that. As the sun rose higher, warming the camp with pale gold light, the women began to feel something they had not felt in months: equilibrium. Not comfort, not hope. Those were luxuries they were not ready for, but balance, a steadying of the trembling ground beneath their feet. Their hearts still beat quickly, but not from terror. Their breath still shook, but not from dread. Slowly, cautiously, their bodies began to loosen. A medic handed the older woman a piece of clean cloth to wipe her face. She accepted it weakly, her eyes full of disbelief. "Danke," she whispered, a word that felt strange on her tongue after so long without anything to be thankful for. The medic nodded with a small smile and moved on. All around them, small gestures like these accumulated, quiet, wordless offerings that slowly rebuilt a sense of human dignity stripped away by the war. A soldier placed a blanket around a shivering prisoner's shoulders. Another brought out extra canteens when he noticed several women were too dehydrated to speak. A medic stepped between two arguing soldiers to make sure their raised voices didn't frighten the captives. Piece by piece, gesture by gesture, the unbearable tension inside the women began to loosen. Their fear, once dense enough to crush the air from their lungs, thinned into something manageable, something human. The camp was still a prison. They were still captives. Their fate was still uncertain. But the expected cruelty had not come. The humiliation they feared had not materialized. Instead, they found themselves in a place that operated not on hatred, but on rules. A place where even prisoners, especially prisoners, were treated with structure and restraint. And that realization alone was enough to make the world feel different. By the time the medical checks neared completion, the women found themselves sitting in a silence that no longer felt suffocating. A silence that allowed them, for the first time since capture, to breathe. Not freely, not fully, but enough. Enough to remember they were human. Enough to believe that, in this strange American camp, they might be treated as such. By the time noon approached, the first sharp edges of fear had dulled, leaving behind a cautious, tentative relief. The women began to realize in small, almost imperceptible moments that the camp was not the hostile, punishing environment they had imagined. Their initial terror, a tight coil wound by months of misinformation, fear, and war-hardened instinct, slowly unraveled under the simple, consistent behaviors of their captors. Every small gesture, the calm voice of a guard, the careful touch of a medic, the deliberate organization of the camp, signaled a reality that was impossible to ignore. They were not being led to humiliation. They were being processed. They were being kept alive. They were, in a strange and shocking way, safe. That word safe, so foreign in the context of the past few years, began to echo in their minds with a weight that was almost disorienting. As they settled into this unexpected understanding, some of the women began to speak quietly among themselves. The younger ones whispered their disbelief, voices tinged with skepticism. "Are we dreaming?" one murmured, staring at the neat rows of tents and the orderly distribution of food and water. Another replied in a hushed tone, "It feels impossible. It cannot be this easy. They are Americans, they are soldiers, they should—" Her voice trailed off, left unfinished by the weight of expectation built over months of fear. The older women, who had endured more of the war's harshest realities, merely shook their heads with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had learned, through experience, that hope must be approached carefully, always with caution, yet even they could not deny the pattern forming before them. A pattern of restraint, consistency, and unexpected humanity. The realization of safety, however fragile, began to seep deeper. One by one, the prisoners allowed themselves small physical relaxations. Shoulders uncurled from the tension of constant vigilance, and hands unclenched from the defensive positions they had maintained for so long. A woman who had been gripping the edges of her bench for hours leaned back fully for the first time, eyes closed, savoring the warmth of the sun cutting through the chill of the morning. Another stretched her legs, feeling muscles that had been tight and overworked from continuous marching, and fear slowly loosen. They began to breathe in rhythm with the world around them, a rhythm they had long been denied. The camp, still a prison, was no longer a place of immediate threat. It had become, paradoxically, a place of refuge, a structure of order in the chaos that had defined their lives for so long. The medics, ever attentive, recognized the subtle shift in body language and responded with quiet gestures of support. One handed a towel to a woman whose hair was matted with dust and sweat. Another offered a drink to a group of women whose mouths were dry from dehydration. Even the guards, who had maintained a strict distance, softened their tone when issuing routine directions, aware that the prisoners were beginning to internalize a sense of trust they had almost forgotten could exist. The women's response was equally cautious but increasingly receptive. Eyes that had once darted constantly, scanning for threats, now lingered on the scene around them. They observed the meticulous organization of the tents, the careful folding of blankets, the methodical cleaning of utensils and bedding. This attention to order, which would have once seemed trivial, now spoke volumes to the prisoners. It was a demonstration of care, a silent promise that the rules of this place were meant to protect rather than to punish. Some women, still wary of the unfamiliar calm, took tentative steps to communicate with the medics. Words came haltingly, broken by accents and long stretches of silence. They asked for explanations about the routines, about the purpose of the inspections, and about the next steps in their confinement. Each question, each gesture of inquiry, was met with patience. The medics responded carefully, often with gestures, simple English phrases, and a remarkable tolerance for repeated clarification. The women realized that no question was met with scorn, no mistake with punishment. Even minor misunderstandings, mispronounced words, incorrect gestures, were met with gentle corrections. The absence of anger, of humiliation, or of ridicule itself became a profound revelation more significant than any material comfort could provide. By mid-morning, the atmosphere in the processing area had shifted almost entirely. Fear still lingered at the edges, a shadow in the corners of the women's minds. But the dominant sentiment was no longer panic. It was an unsettled relief. Their movements, once stiff and mechanical, began to display a tentative fluidity. They sat more naturally on the benches, shifted their weight comfortably, and even exchanged brief, whispered observations with one another. They remarked on the organization of the camp, on the unexpected cleanliness of the tents, on the relative calm of the guards. For the first time, some of the women allowed themselves to notice details in their surroundings beyond the immediate concern for survival. A small bird hopping across the yard, the faint smell of pine from the surrounding trees, the steady hum of camp activity. All these details, once invisible under the pressure of fear, became part of their awareness. The world, though still dangerous, seemed to contain spaces that were not defined by threat. The realization that their captors were not intending harm, but were adhering to procedures, began to deepen further. Conversations among the prisoners started to reflect a more nuanced understanding of their circumstances. "They are soldiers," one whispered, almost to herself, "but they are following rules. They do not need to humiliate us." Another added, "They are keeping order. That is all. They are not cruel, not to us, not today." These statements were soft, quiet, and hesitant, but they were loaded with significance. To have the courage to acknowledge such a simple truth, to admit, even silently, that they were not under imminent threat, was a profound shift in perspective for women who had spent months preparing for the worst at every turn. As noon approached, the women also began to notice subtle acts of humanity that went beyond the bare requirements of protocol. A soldier carried extra blankets across the yard, careful not to trip over the uneven ground. Another laid out a few wooden chairs under the shade of a canvas canopy, providing space for the elderly and infirm to rest comfortably. Even the medics demonstrated a kind of quiet attentiveness that suggested empathy without sentimentality. Their eyes tracked the women's movements, their gestures measured to provide assistance only when necessary. These were not grand acts of kindness. They were simple, restrained, deliberate gestures that communicated an acknowledgement of human dignity, a message that in a place designed to control and confine, the prisoners still mattered as people. The psychological impact of these small, consistent actions was immense. Many of the women, who had long expected constant fear, began to relax their vigilance, even if only slightly. Their minds, once entirely consumed by anticipation of cruelty, were now able to consider the possibility that safety could exist, even within the confines of a prison camp. Some allowed themselves to close their eyes briefly, listening to the distant sounds of the camp without flinching. Others dared a small smile, almost imperceptible, toward a fellow prisoner or a medic. These gestures, though minimal, represented enormous progress. They were first steps toward reclaiming a sense of normalcy, a sense of self, within the unnatural context of captivity. Even communication among the prisoners evolved. Women who had huddled in silence during the morning's inspection now spoke in hushed tones about the process, exchanging observations about the camp's layout, the medics' actions, and the overall calm they were experiencing. One young woman remarked that the benches, though hard, were cleaner than anything she had encountered in months. Another noted that the water offered to them was cool and refreshing, a sensation that brought tears to her eyes simply because it felt like relief. These conversations, though minor, reinforced the understanding that their immediate circumstances were not threatening, a realization that was almost revolutionary after months of fear-driven survival. The shift in atmosphere also extended to the broader group dynamics among the prisoners. Where there had once been tension, suspicion, and near constant vigilance, a tentative sense of solidarity began to emerge. Women began to watch out for one another more openly, offering quiet reassurances, helping each other adjust blankets, or nudging one another to drink water. These small acts of support were natural responses to the absence of direct threat, but they were also deeply symbolic. They represented the slow reconstruction of trust, not just in their captors, but in each other. For women who had survived fear, exhaustion, and the collapse of familiar social structures, this sense of mutual reliance was a fragile but vital lifeline. By mid-afternoon, the cumulative effect of these experiences had taken root. Fear, though never completely erased, had transformed from a raw, immediate reaction to a background awareness that could be managed. The women began to exhibit behaviors that suggested internalized comprehension of their situation. Some adjusted clothing to sit more comfortably. Others reached for water or blankets without hesitation. A few even dared to look around the camp, beyond their immediate surroundings, noticing patterns of order and organization that reinforced the understanding that the camp operated according to rules, not malice. The cumulative impact of these small gestures, both from the medics and from the prisoners themselves, was profound. It was a psychological shift that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the aftermath of violence and fear. By the time the day wore on, the women were, in many ways, experiencing a new reality. A reality in which captivity did not automatically equate to degradation. A reality in which order and routine, though imposed, were preferable to chaos and violence. A reality in which the gestures of those around them, small, deliberate, and consistent, offered proof that dignity could still exist even in the confines of a prison camp. In these quiet, cumulative moments, the women began to reclaim something fundamental that the war had stripped away, a sense of themselves as human beings capable of experiencing relief, comfort, and cautious optimism. The realization that the order to undress and submit to inspection had been a procedural formality, not a prelude to cruelty, crystallized fully. They could now comprehend that the camp's purpose was administrative, not punitive. The relief they felt was not merely physical. It was psychological, a deep internal shift that allowed them to reframe their understanding of captivity. The fear that had dominated every movement, every glance, and every breath for days and weeks was replaced, tentatively, by comprehension and recognition of a fundamental truth: they were alive, and their humanity had not been extinguished. And so, as the afternoon sun warmed the campgrounds and cast long shadows across the orderly tents and benches, the German POW women finally allowed themselves to feel the first real taste of relief. Not elation, not joy. Those were luxuries they could not yet afford, but relief. The kind of relief that comes when one realizes that the anticipated horror has not materialized. That the enemy, in this moment, was adhering to rules rather than exploiting weakness. That the order to undress, which had once struck terror into their hearts, was nothing more than a routine, bureaucratic necessity, a moment of procedure rather than punishment. In that realization, they began to understand something profound, that even in a prison camp, even under the shadow of war, the smallest gestures of care, the quiet consistency of discipline, and the simple recognition of their humanity could be powerful enough to restore dignity. And in that restoration, they found a fragile, invaluable sense of hope, a sense that perhaps, after everything, the war had not succeeded in stripping them of everything that made them human.